Oh, come on, come on. Good morning. So thanks so much for being here. Russ Archibald, our LAC chair, was meant to do the words of welcome, but as I think you know, there's a strike going on, and I'm assuming that he's been delayed in that regard. But he may slide in and have some words to offer at some point during the agenda. I really want to thank everybody for coming, for taking the time. It's always so busy, and November seems to be particularly busy. So I want to thank you for coming to share in our celebration of the Hamilton OCAL Clinic's 30th anniversary. And of course, because we're always involved in translating knowledge and trying to mobilize the use of knowledge in workplaces and also in our clinical work where we take the knowledge of the workplace, knowledge of exposures and knowledge of disease, and translate that into medical and scientific reports to support work-relatedness, and then also our inquiry and group work where we try to take that knowledge and share it with workplaces in a way that they can actually functionally make a change that for the better. So I'm not going to spend too much time up here because we're already a little bit behind. And Alec is meant to be the first speaker. However, Leo Gerard is meant to tune in during Andy's talk, but they've emailed to ask if they can call, if we can talk to him now. So I'm going to call him. Oh, you can hear that. Oh, isn't this dramatic? They sent me a picture, but... Hi, it's Val Wolf from OCAL. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Valerie.
Hi,
Yes.
So I've got the, yeah, nice talking to you. Is Leo there? Is he able, so we're just opening the event, and we appreciate Leo's willingness to say a few words about the history of the clinic and about knowledge activism in general. So is he there?
Sure. Let me get him on the phone, Valerie. Yes, just a moment.
Sorry for the inconvenience. I'd love to have been there, but I'm in the process of trying to move my address and my bank accounts and everything from Pittsburgh to Sudbury, and I had to go do it in person. So anyhow, it's out of Trumpland.
We're very glad you can join us in any capacity. I'm holding the phone up to the microphone in a church basement right now. Everyone's listening with keen ears. Yep.
He was here 15 years ago in this very spot.
Okay, John points out that the 15-year event, so half our life ago, that you were here at this very podium because we are in the same church across from the clinic.
Oh, cool. You know that this was I guess it's time we could tell the inside story that people that had a role in helping bring OCAL about and the stuff that we did. The reality is that Local 1005, when C. Taylor was the president, actively tried to form a clinic supported by Local 1005 at a storefront. And it became, with all due respect, too much for them, even as a large local they were at that time, to sustain it. And at the same time that was going on in Hamilton with the local unions, there was a conflict going on at the Havilland, but at the airport over medical issues. And if I remember, there was some stuff about aluminum shavings and stuff. And there was a fairly hard confrontation that the labor movement was supporting the workers at the Havilland. And at that time, my sister actually worked at the Havilland, and she was one of the people that was concerned about the health issues. So through the work of the Ontario Federation of Labor, with Gordie Wilson, myself, Bob Nickerson, Fred Pomeroy, we started to make a lot of noise in our unions and putting a lot of pressure. And Bob Elgie was, I can't remember if he was the head of workers' comp or if he was in some other role with the government, I just don't remember. But we managed to get a meeting with the strong case for a standalone operation, and to do a pilot project, and to do it in Hamilton. And we had some management support for the clinic from Silco manager guy, I forget, Bob something or other, I can't remember his last. Anyhow,
Milborn.
we had agreed that we'd go in and Milborn, that's it. We agreed that we'd go in and make the case to the Premier, which we got to in the cabinet, and Betty Stevenson was there and Bob Elgie was there. And we agreed that we'd ask for $1 million. We agreed amongst ourselves that we'd make the case for $1 million over an extended period of time. And so we go into the meeting, and we're having this impassioned discussion about the health of workers and the need to have them be able to go to clinics and with doctors that have an understanding of what it's like to work in an industrial establishment or a hospital, or all the dangers. And we were really pounding the case out real hard. And Peterson was giving some indications that he was supportive. And at one point he said to Betty Stevenson, he said, how would this work with they got these health councils? And she said, well, they'll be a little concerned that you're taking the authority away from them. And he said, no, we're not doing that. He said, but if we were to do this, what do you think? Then he turns to Gordy Wilson and said, how much do you think you'd need to do projects? He made the mistake of saying plural. And Gordy jumped on it right away and said, $5 million. So Gordy jumped it from 1 to 5. And so we had a fairly good discussion about it, extended over a period of time, and then we'd be able to prove our worth first in the clinic in Hamilton, then Toronto, and then in other places. And we had a really powerful discussion about, and we really, in a way that is a bit threatening, said that if we couldn't get these clinics that would have rank and file and labor involvement and have doctors and other hygienists that could be there, that would understand that what it's like to work in a workplace and the kinds of illnesses and troubles that you get that are often maybe not fatal but long lasting, and people need to be able to see doctors that they knew they could trust and knew that had some bigger understanding than just some guy who makes a lot of money doing surgery or some stupid shit like that. And so the discussion went really well. And we kicked it off in Hamilton. And we had a really good functioning committee in Hamilton. And even for the sake of sounding a little bit too soft on him, Bob Milburn was very supportive of the process. And some of the local union guys from 1005 who were on the committee, and some of the folks from the Labor Council who were on the advisory committee, really pitched in good, and we made the case that the experimental clinic in Hamilton deserved to be expended. And again, I kind of lost track. I think we've got 5 clinics, and I've had 5 for an extended period of time. But we should have no illusions that we need to keep it as a profile. We need to keep active about it, because especially with the bundles that we got in Ontario now, they would be happy to kill it. And then the other thing is that we had an idea from this that was passed on to us in the Manitoba Federation of Labor. Dick Martin, God, that's almost 25 years ago. Dick Martin was president of the Manitoba Federation of Labor. And they got a kickoff to something similar to a health clinic. It was covered by workers, and we often use that as a benchmark for saying, look, if they can do it there, we can do it here. So the inside game is that the key leaders of the labor movement in Ontario at the time actually got our act together and made the case. And as a result of making the case and getting some initial looks of interest from the premier at the time. Gordy was smart enough to jump from 1 million to 5, and to get that on a conditional basis that the clinics would be constructive and that we'd be on an experimental basis for the first one or two, and then we could prove our case for releasing of more of the funding. And unfortunately for me to admit it, I've lost track of the funding and the fighting and the level of support from the provincial government. I worry about it just like I worry about the Worker Center. There's this effort I was able to stick my 2 cents in against it. George DeGraciatis, whatever his name was, he was promoting the merger of OCAL and the Worker Center. And it was pretty transparent that he was promoting that so he could cut the budget of both and jam them together. And we fought him. And I actually came from Pittsburgh and had with John Perkman meetings with him and really told him, excuse the language, but if he did that, we'd fuck him to a standstill. And that just shit wasn't going to happen. It was a pretty animated discussion that I had with him in some restaurant and said, there's steelworker blood in those clinics and those workers, and you won't get away with it. And so I never heard back.
No.
And I said, he's gone, hit the trail, but I'd never forget that he represented the government. And,
yeah.
So.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to take questions, but there's, we ought to be proud of the fact that the labor movement in Ontario pulled this off, and like you said, it's now been 15 years, and the quote experiment has been a huge success. But what we have to watch for now is that, especially with this gang, is that we need to have, I think, the key leaders of the labor movement sit down with people from the Worker Center in OCAL. I remember the Industrial Disease Standard Panel. Harris killed that the first month he was back in office. That's still an interesting thing we should fight to create, the Industrial Disease Standard Panel,
yep,
and attach that to both the Worker Center and the clinics. Because a lot of our illnesses come from exposures, and there's certainly not enough publicizing the industrial diseases from exposure. And I know that one of my mentors, that Homer Seguin, would be on this like a fly on honey. So, but I'd be happy to take some questions before I go.
Okay, thank you very much, Leo. Thank you. Does anybody have a quick question for Leo?
I wish I could. I wish I could be there, because celebrating the 50th anniversary and an experiment that the labor movement leaders were able to pull together, and it's good for rank and file workers. That everybody who continues to be involved in the clinics and/or the Worker Center deserve a big hand of applause, because we're making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, hallelujah. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't think there are any questions. So we did videotape this episode, but we didn't put your picture on the screen. But maybe we can integrate it when we put the video up on YouTube, so your voice will be heard. And thank you for sharing some of the history of what was involved in starting and how much we owe to the steelworkers who started the effort in Hamilton more than 30 years ago. So thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Oh, yeah.
If you put me on TV, that'll be good, because they'll sell a lot of TVs. My wife said she knows she'll sell ours.
Okay. Thanks. Take care.
You should congratulate yourselves. You're making a difference, and this is really important. And I give you all my best wishes and wish I was there. Maybe we'll get a chance to see each other when I'm actually relocated totally.
Good. Yeah, we'll recruit you for the next event. We'll make this one an annual one too, maybe, and we'll maybe call you next year. Okay, thanks, Leo. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, that was great. I hope you guys could hear. I didn't want to interrupt him and I didn't test the audio on my phone beforehand. So, okay, I think without ado, we'll call Alec up to do his presentation, which is already on the slides here.
I've worked just about everywhere. I was the health and safety director at the Occupational Health and Safety branch at MOL. I worked at the old WCB before it was renamed, and in legal clinics, which are currently in a struggle for survival, like Injured Workers Consultants and IAVCO. So I've been around the block. And now I'm retired and doing more or less whatever is most important. That includes Asbestos-Free Canada. I'm also working on a project called Disability in Work Canada, which is about dramatic improvement in the employment of persons with disabilities. So I'm not going to talk. I was down for half an hour, and following Leo Gerard, always a challenge. I will not go half an hour. I'll try to finish in 10-15 minutes, and that'll, I think, help with the timing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So let's do that. So, well, Leo took about 2/3 of my first bullet point, which was I was going to give a high-level background on the founding of the OCAL Clinic. So I'll stick to sort of more the almost historical background. He's provided so much of the political context, the connections that were made, etc., at such a vital time, and you can see how important it is sometimes to just go hard and sort of demand something. And that's what he did. Then the overview of Hamilton, I'm not trying to give a history of the Hamilton Clinic. I'm more trying to give the philosophy and the underpinnings. And then at the end, I give some examples from the time that I was managing director, all of which are still continuing. And I think those will be detailed, especially by Terry a little bit later. So like a number of people in the room, I've been around a long time. I went to my first labor picket line as a 17-year-old high school student in London, Ontario in 1969, 50 years ago. I've been around a long time, and in the fall of '69 was also the anti-war movement in the United States, where I was extremely active. The biggest political demonstration in American history took place November 15th, 1969 in Washington. I was there. So at the same time in Ontario, there was a ferment of activism, and you couldn't possibly exaggerate how significant this was. I'd say it marked especially the 70s, but right through into the 80s. On one side were workers and unions challenging the unsafe working conditions and unhealthy working conditions that they had endured for a very long time, really as far back as you can remember. And as you'll see on the next slide, also there was a parallel struggle, and often intermingled, of injured workers and occupational disease victims. So on the worker side, we just heard Leo, and I think Leo was involved. That he goes back a long way as well in the incredibly important events that took place in Elliott Lake in 1974, when thousands of uranium miners who were vital to the Cold War effort of the United States and Canada went on wildcat strike and said, we are not stopping this strike until we get action on the working conditions that are affecting us. And by the way, they didn't have a lot of research knowledge, although there was some. It was more or less practical frontline knowledge. They knew something was really hurting them and would hurt their health in the future. And they sparked, along with a whole lot of other things, but really they were at the core of it, the appointment of Professor Ham from University of Toronto. The Ham Commission reported later in the 70s. And it was Ham that really pulled together a whole lot of strands of thinking. There's a lot of input from the labor movement, and he came out the other end of it with the structure of health and safety in Ontario, both the legal and institutional, that with some changes exists to the present day. So he marked our history for 40 years. And I just mentioned the absolute highlights, the role for Ministry of Labor. A lot of health and safety functions were consolidated from some other ministries into Ministry of Labor. And at the same time, legal rights were given to workers. And we have exercised those rights ever since, with varying degrees of success. And of course, it includes the landmark right to refuse unsafe work, which lots could be done to improve on the way that functions in practice. And Andy King's sitting in the room, who's researched some of the gaps in how it really works. Having said that, it really was a power shift, and in the right situation made an enormous difference. So at the same time, we had injured workers and occupational disease victims on the streets at Queen's Park, at their MPP's offices and many other places for a long time at a very high level. Ultimately, thousands of people in one place at one time on June 1st, 1983. I was there too, 36 years ago. And that put workers' compensation on the agenda in Ontario in a very big way. And again, I'm just giving you one bullet point in a presentation. You could spend a couple of days on the history of that movement. And there are people in this room who played a big role in it and are proud of what we've done. So that led to a lot of changes. I'm focusing on the structural ones. It was the creation of the Independent Appeals Tribunal, which is still at arm's length from the board. It's still a place workers can go and get some degree of justice. It's not as independent as it used to be. Office of the Worker Advisor, where I was privileged to be director a couple times, and the Office of the Employer Advisor, and the old Industrial Disease Standards Panel, which changed into the Occupational Disease Panel, and then was unfortunately eliminated in 1996. Having said that, it had a over 10-year history making a huge contribution, and OCOW was all intermingled. The folks who ended up in OCOW were all intermingled with that process. But the missing piece. The missing piece, you can change structure, you can change even power relations, but if you lack the knowledge and expertise to take advantage of the situation, you're not in good shape. So often, and when I say workplace parties, I mean it sincerely. This is obviously a worker-dominated, union-dominated, community-based event, but there are two workplace parties, and it includes employers. Employers weren't well informed either, and that was part of the problem, along with attitude. So there was a gap that everyone recognized, and just finished hearing Leo was recognized at the grassroots here in Hamilton by Local 1005 and also I think by the leadership of Steel at that time. So unions knew this, and especially in Hamilton, knew resources had to be provided, and to give incredible credit to the leadership of 1005, to Leo and others, they stepped up and spent a lot of money on those resources in the early years, long before there was an OCOW per se. But as he said, it wasn't sustainable. And the political world ultimately took notice, and the initial OCOW clinics were established in the late 80s. Hamilton obviously led the way. Now, I've been around for the whole journey. In fact, I think I was at some secret meetings at the ministry with Gord Wilson that I'm realizing now must have played a role in this, so I can talk about them now too. Where I was the expert resource that he needed for some conversations, and so I was in on some of those discussions, and it was so clear how we were rocking their world. Crystal clear. I vividly remember. I think it was Greg Sorbara, who was their Minister of Labor at that time, and they absolutely knew they had to do something. So I don't think anyone in this room thinks this was given for charitable reasons or whatever. It was a response to a power relationship and activism. So another thing about OCOW, I used to really think it was way bigger than it actually was. And Hamilton OCOW in particular, when I became managing director, I was sort of shocked by how small OCOW is and how limited the resources. And it's never been a big group here in Hamilton. But what an outstanding contribution's been made. I'm just going to hit absolute highlights, and others will talk about other things. So just a brief comment on knowledge activism, and there's going to be a lot more later on. It's the core of everything as far as I'm concerned. When I got started, we used the term knowledge transfer a lot. And knowledge transfer, it has such an elitist type concept to it. There's some academic researcher, they've got the knowledge and they're going to transfer it to us. I mean, the whole thing, I always rebelled against it right from the first time I heard it, but it was what was being in use at the time. KT, they used to call it. So I've always liked the term knowledge mobilization. And there are folks in this room who I think really coined the term knowledge activism. And in the minute I heard it, I thought, yeah, that's what really resonates for me. Because it's about maximizing the real world impact of knowledge. And it's a two-way collaboration. Knowledge is not the exclusive purview of researchers, academics, but the workplace parties, including ordinary workers at the front line. And the researchers are learning at the same time as the workers and employers are learning. It's absolutely a two-way street. And OCal in Hamilton has modeled that, I think, instinctively right from day one. It's not just vital for making specific changes, but more fundamentally, it contributes to everything that's important. And I know there are big debates about some of these things, but it's structures like joint health and safety committees and other related structures, processes that can be as simple as an inspection. And I think all of us know you can do an inspection that's on the surface, and then you can do an investigation that goes way deeper. It includes culture, lots of debates about culture. I do believe in talking about and working on culture, but often with a much different content than some other models of culture. And of course, practices. Practices really is where it comes home, because you cannot have sustainable OC health and safety without all those things, and especially without knowledge activism. And I mentioned again, it's seen as, of course it came from the labor movement and from worker activists, but I don't like to just confine it to that. In big chunks of my career, especially at MOL, I spent enormous lengths of time with employer representatives, sometimes days at a time. I can vividly remember 1- and 2-day meetings with the health and safety directors of the big three, just as one example, and lots of others. And I met some amazing people who do want to make change. Often in the structure they're working within, they had to make a case to their senior management. Sometimes they had to put their job on the line. I met more than one health and safety manager, director in a big company who risked losing their job over some issue where they wanted to walk at least part way with the union. So knowledge activism, of course, it's core for us, but we'd like some other folks to join in. And I think OCal in Hamilton's done a lot of that. Probably people don't know a lot of the conversations that OCal Clinic in Hamilton has had with frontline employers. And you'll see a little later, it includes in some real challenging situations. And the collaboration and mutual learning that I mentioned, it's always been there with OCal. Just a couple of examples that I'll use here. And these are from my time as managing director from 2008 to 2012. So I want to start with vulnerable workers. Everybody talks about the precarious work of today, the gig economy, vulnerable workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, often it's mentioned and then little is done. OCal Clinic here has made an enormous commitment of time and resources to these issues. At a certain point, with some help with extra funding, I don't even know if that exists anymore, but for a few years we had some extra funding, and primarily sort of Niagara Peninsula and then down toward the sort of middle of Western Ontario, I guess we can say, in Simcoe. All kinds of different ethnicities and backgrounds for these workers, and incredible impact that is relatively little known, I would say, and should be better known. Not just on individual workers, but on the culture and practices of employers, which is important too. That's part of it's been frontline one-on-one service to individual migrant workers, and I'm moved even today to remember some of the incidents that I was part of, sitting with a Mexican worker who has lost virtually all the sight in their eye and thinking, how can they go forward? And they don't want to make a claim because they don't want to be sent home. And in this case, I think it was Michelle too from the clinic, just patiently going through things as we tried to bolster up this worker, and broken Spanish actually as we were doing. And I feel they left that encounter knowing that although part of this country had exploited them, another part was at least supporting them. So the frontline one-on-one, very important, but way beyond that, as you'll see. Educational workshops for migrant workers. I mean, just imagine, they're in town for Friday night, and I think it was Murray, John, various others, and they're learning about pesticide safety, they're learning about eye safety, and they're all in one room together, and they're feeling some degree of power in the situation, which of course they didn't feel in their work situations. And not just that, some farm employers let us come on site and do that work. I vividly remember one of the farm worker sort of stakeholder gatherings where a couple of farm employers stood up and said, our association didn't want us to come, but we came anyway because we believe in what you're doing. So don't think it's simple, all farmers bad, all employers bad. It's a mixed picture, and there have been some great interactions. So at the highest level, I just mentioned the multi-stakeholder gatherings. They were a brilliant innovation. I'm not sure who at the clinic came up with them. Such a simple concept. Let's get everybody together in one room who deals with migrant farm workers. The consulates, the government people, the board, the health providers, the public health authorities, local volunteers from even churches who are doing dinners and other support for farm workers, people concerned about the housing issue, and OCAL. And OCAL made that happen. And these were rich, unbelievable meetings. And one I remember, it was I think about half a dozen Thai mushroom picking women who did a skit. Does people remember that? And if anybody else was there? And I just thought, here are these women, and of course it crosses over with sexual trafficking and a lot of bad things. There's a lot of bad things in the Thai farm worker community that go way beyond conditions of work. And here they are with this whole other audience that would never ordinarily meet them. And we're eating their mushrooms, and they're showing us what their work is like. It was, I'd say for some people, transformative. And another little footnote of history. We took Tony Dean down to Simcoe one night in 2009 to show him what the work in Simcoe was all about. And he has said to me and many others that was the most single influential event in his whole study of our health and safety system in Ontario in 2009, was that moment when he saw what we were doing and he met those farm workers firsthand. So the impact of doing this kind of work is way, way beyond case by case, and it can be systemic. Linking return to work and prevention. I mentioned my career earlier. I've always been so frustrated by the siloed approach to health safety, workers' compensation, return to work, and disability. It's unfortunately still all too common, although I think we've made some progress. And it's in unions even. It's not just employer side or the government. And there's some employers and unions that do a fantastic job pulling it all together. I don't want to say there aren't. But in particular, the areas of being injured, needing to return to work, needing accommodation, needing a change in working conditions, somehow linking that to prevention. And I think it was Ona who served up to the clinic an opportunity. I think I went to Ona and said, who's your worst employer that will have to work with us pretty well? Because they're desperate. And OPSU stepped up, SEIU stepped up, and we had all three unions solid on this. We had a really great partner at Niagara Health, their VP for HR, and it all came together in a spectacular way, as you'll see. And it's still alive. It's had its ups and downs. I think NHS is the biggest single healthcare employer in the province, thousands of workers. I think the figure I heard was 7,000 or 8,000 in the bargaining units. Complex. It's had its tough times as a workplace. Lots of challenges, way beyond even health and safety, labor relations challenges, etc. What a multi-party, multi-partner partnership. It was the unions, the employer, of course, OCAL, the old occupational disease response team, ALBIEXA. It's now called Prevention Link. He did the fundamental sort of study of what was really going on in that workplace that formed the basis for what we did in future. We were supported by WSIB, by the way, to the very highest level of the chair and CEO, by their board of directors, by the Ministry of Labor, and a free research support from Institute for Work and Health, which was quite important for evaluating success. So look at that. And at the core of that was this clinic. It's pretty incredible. The breakthrough for them was they realized, as an employer, they had to link return to work and primary prevention. OCAL played a really interesting role, and it showed the power of the interdisciplinary teams. We could offer them help dealing with individual cases when they got so complex that it was beyond the sort of frontline union and employer capacity. So we had that capacity. And also, we had an ergonomist and were able to offer support to an ergonomics action team. And they did so many interesting things there. What can poison return to work in any workplace, union or non-union, is when the employer solution is, oh, the work's too heavy for you, you've gotten injured. Well, we'll give that to so-and-so. And so-and-so gets injured. Well, we'll give it to so-and-so. So there's sort of a last person standing type approach which just starts poisoning everything and making people resent the injured worker. But when you can start changing the conditions of work, then everybody's involved and they see that the employer is serious about changing things, and it'll also help the worker believe that if they return to work they won't get hurt again. And that is at the best of it what's been accomplished in NHS. I know there was a tremendous initiative they did around the handling of linens, mechanizing a lot of the process that made a huge difference at the time. I haven't kept up with all the details since, but the ergonomics action team was really important. And finally, I'll finish with prevention tool development. I mentioned how small the team is here. When you're small, you naturally start drifting into thinking, you know what, if we can create a tool, that multiplies us by, probably at the beginning we were thinking tenfold, but it ends up being thousandfold or 10,000-fold. The impact of these tools is something incredible. So I'm just going to mention two. First is the heat stress tool. I remember when I first saw it, and I'm not going to mention any names. I think I did mention Michelle, but I really purposely am not mentioning names because it's such a tight team. But so I won't mention who developed it, but he is sitting in the room. And I remember thinking, it's John O'Dyke, let's face it. I saw it and I thought, how simple this thing is. You can cut it out on a sheet of paper and put a push pin in it and twirl it around, and it will tell you the combination of humidity and temperature that will generate various responses in the workplace to avoid damage to the body from heat stress. Why hasn't someone thought of this? So it's a simple tool, so simple you can print it on a sheet of paper, cut it out, and put that push pin in, and it gives you a tool that's objective, tested by science, and that can tell the employer, this worker can't work longer than 15 minutes. They've got to hydrate. And it ultimately reach a point where no one should be working in this humidity and temperature. And this is a life and death issue because, as I think probably all of you know, there have been some tragic deaths from heat stress in this province, both indoor work, like bakeries, and outdoor. Interestingly, I think the tool was adopted in, Manitoba before it was adopted officially in Ontario, which helped us get it adopted in Ontario. So it's sort of an official recognized tool of health and safety regulation in at least one other jurisdiction, and maybe it's gone further since then. So probably there are uses of this tool that none of us even know about. It's just out there and has been adopted or even stolen by others in the system. There it is. Mental injury toolkit. There'll be lots more on this. I'm giving just one slide. But I want to speak to the process. This is a powerful tool. It's had a big impact already and will have more in future. And it's sophisticated. It's based on science, research. I think ultimately it was taken from a tool in Denmark called Kopsok. But it's simple as well. And it generates a spreadsheet printout. And it lets us look deep in the workplace, both psychosocial and also physical factors. It's a brilliant piece of work, but it wasn't just some out of one person's mind. It was a collaborative effort of many, many people and came from deep engagement between OCOW. In this case, it was OCOW in general, but it was the Hamilton Clinic, John again, who provided the expertise to make it happen. And as you'll hear, it's been used in some very large-scale situations as well as small-scale. And what it recognized and gave sort of, I guess we'll say, data to support is that mental injuries are just as serious and real as physical injuries. And of course, even looking back to when it started, we made a lot of progress on that in Ontario, and this tool was influential in no small part. Okay, I'll finish with the next 30 years. You always want to finish with that kind of perspective. Oh, it's scary. So I'll be almost 100 years old. Maybe I'll make it back. There's no end of challenges. I'm just mentioning a couple of them. Workplaces have changed a lot. We've got new hazards that we know very little about, and unfortunately, often they're being introduced into the workplace with little testing or research behind them, like nanoparticles, which can cross, some of them at least, can cross the blood-brain barrier. The rise in precarious work and the gig economy. When this clinic started, Local 1005, I don't know how many members they had, maybe more than 20,000. It was an enormous. 13 and a half. 13 and a half? It was an enormous workplace. And you felt you were dealing with something that would be there forever. And here we are 30 years later, and it's much different. Having said that, the overall picture is no different than it was then. We have to link knowledge and activism, and that's in its broadest sense. That's the pathway to healthy workplaces. And I know that this clinic and those who carry on its proud tradition as these younger people join, you're going to join that journey, and you're going to contribute equally to your forebears, and we'll be looking back 30 years from now on some developments that we can't imagine right now, but are going to be real. They're going to help workers in this area and well beyond, and we'll be just as proud of them as we're proud of what's happened in the last 30. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.